Hello, my name is Michelle Marinkovich, and I'm a member of the Stanford Historical Society Program Committee that arranges these presentations. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation on excuse me. I usually don't get choked up this early. On eugenics at Stanford, Jordan, Terman, and other legacies. At a time when extremist ideas are circling around notions of race, ethnicity, and religion, it's good to revisit earlier debates on these questions, although many of us had thought that some of these debates had actually been put to rest, and unfortunately have not been. For this presentation on eugenics in Stanford, we are pleased to have as our presenter Professor Murphy Halliburton of Queens College and Graduate Center, City University of New York. He brings a rare combination of extensive Stanford experience, lived experience, along with research skills, objectivity, and curiosity of a social scientist whose fields span medical, cultural, psychological, anthropology, and also anthropology of science. In terms of his Stanford background, Murphy grew up on the campus as the son of Professor David Halliburton of English, Modern Thought and Literature, and Comparative Literature, and his wife, Mary Ann, who taught in local high schools and was also a consultant. Their home was always full of other academics, lively conversation, and good food. Murphy himself chose to go to Stanford, receiving his Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology in 1988. To further prepare himself as an anthropologist, he started studies at the Graduate Center, City University of New York in 1992, receiving his PhD in 2000. While a graduate student there, he began teaching as a lecturer in City College. Later, he rose through the ranks at Queens College, CUNY, reaching full professor in 2018. If I might be allowed a personal note, I was lucky enough to be the first one to give Murphy an academic job because I hired him as an undergraduate employee of the Center for Teaching and Learning long before he graduated. And he was one of the outstanding students that made me so aware of how fortunate we were at CTL to be able to involve our own students in our work. Murphy's research has mostly focused on India, including papers, presentations, and 2 books, India and the Patent Wars, and Mud Packs and Prozac. He has received numerous awards, including an early NSF grant for research in India, a Mellon Mid-Career Faculty Fellowship, and a Fulbright Nehru Senior Research Award. Tonight, however, he'll be sharing his thoughts on his latest research, eugenics in Stanford. Murphy?
Okay, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for reminding me of actually a longer academic career than I recall, from the Center for Teaching and Learning to Queens College. So yeah, that's right. Yeah, it goes a long way back. And thank you also to the Stanford Historical Society for inviting me to do this talk. This is, in a way, the perfect audience. But maybe also not the ideal audience for this. I'm going to tell a story that I think the world outside of Stanford should know, but right now people inside Stanford tend to. I mean, you're the audience who's probably going to be the most informed already of this stuff of anybody I speak to, but hopefully I'll be telling you some things you don't know because I've gone into archival research on this. So, as Michelle just explained, I am teaching at the City University of New York at an undergraduate and an undergraduate institution. And I'm a graduate of Stanford University. I'm also a graduate of the Louis M. Terman Middle School in Palo Alto, which is part of the story. And it's actually, this is how I got interested in this topic. As Michelle mentioned, I had done field work at research in India in anthropology of medicine and science. And I had been reading some of the literature in the field of science and technology studies, an interdisciplinary field that looks at science and technology and medicine as social and cultural practices. And I came across the story of the work of Louis Terman, who developed the Stanford Binet IQ test, and I read about his role in eugenics. And then I went, wait, is that the same Terman that my middle school was named after? And sure enough, I found out that it was. And then I found out that at the same time he was a member of the faculty at Stanford University. And then I found out several other public schools in Palo Alto were also named after Stanford eugenicists. And so that piqued a curiosity into this topic that in bits and pieces, it took me a while to kind of get to it, and actually COVID shut down the archive for 2 years and made this even harder to finish. I decided to pursue the story, like what was behind this. Why, I mean, the first question I had was why did the Palo Alto Public School District name several schools after eugenicists? And they have since renamed them. I wrote an email to the board of the Palo Alto School District saying, do you know the history of Louis Terman and also David Starr Jordan? There was a Jordan Middle School, and Ray Lyman Wilbur. There was a Wilbur Middle School as well, and that they're all eugenicists. I told them a little bit of something about him. I mentioned that I had gone to Terman Middle School and that I was currently a professor doing research on this topic. I never heard back from any of the board at Palo Alto, but I did later on learn that others in the community and some in the PTSA in Palo Alto were onto the same issue, and they had been pressuring the board about the same thing. And so they did change the names of all three of these schools. And so today, Louis Terman Middle School is now Fletcher Middle School, named after, I'm forgetting her first name, maybe Louise Fletcher. Louise Ellen, okay. Who was a Holocaust survivor who settled in Palo Alto. And then Jordan and Wilbur schools were also renamed, but I won't go into the details of those stories. But then I was curious about Stanford. Stanford had not sort of renamed, or I felt dealt with this aspect of the past until recently, and probably most of this audience knows this part of the story. Here we have the statue of Louis Agassiz, who was a polygenicist and race scientist, and also a geologist by many kinds of scientists, including hierarchical studies of race, where he attempted or claimed to have proved the supremacy of the white race. And he was a polygenicist, which meant that he believed that the different kinds of people in the world represented different species. I mean, the concepts were a little different then. Different kinds of people that were on different evolutionary trajectories. And some people were evolving and some people were devolving. So white people were evolving, Africans were devolving. That's just a little bit of Agassiz. So he in the 1906 earthquake, he was actually shaken from his perch, and he landed head first into the pavement below in front of the outer quad, and he was put back into his spot by David Jordan, the president at the time, and who was an acolyte, a student of Agassiz. And here's a photo I took back in 2019. He remained there for over 100 years on the front of Jordan Hall, named after David Starr Jordan, until 2022, when the Stanford Board of Trustees in response to various pressures from various parts of the university, including the students, removed the Agassiz statue. So it came down twice under very different circumstances. First, involuntarily, or maybe it was the first one a message from God. I don't know. And then voluntarily. And then you'll see also that the name Jordan Hall was removed as well. So Stanford also unnamed the hall. And I'm not sure the status of the name. Actually, I've been there a few times since they removed Jordan Hall. I'd be curious if anybody knows what they're calling that building now.
Building 420.
Building 420. Okay. All right. Okay. So they haven't figured out where to go next with that. Okay. Okay. So anyway, let me move forward to tell you a little bit more of the backstory to why this, why we've seen these changes. Well, I should also explain a little bit about the rationale of my research. So Stanford, did this sort of editing of the past, which we're doing around this country, all kinds of different contexts, removing, statues of Civil War generals, even more ambiguous people like Thomas Jefferson from the New York City City Hall, and there's been controversies about the removal and how we're reacting to the past. And this instance makes me think that probably more important than whether we remove names or not is that we should tell the stories about these people. I think if we just remove stuff and we don't tell the stories, we erase this dark, or complex side of our past. We make ourselves look kind of like eternally, virtuous and like we were all attuned to current values. And this story of who these individuals were and why Stanford removed these monuments is not known to the public. I mean, it's probably known to this room, but there's been very little coverage of this. The Stanford Daily covered it, Palo Alto Daily News, but there hasn't been any sort of broader media coverage or academic analysis of the story of eugenics at Stanford. Not because I think Stanford was trying to keep it quiet or anything. I think it's just we haven't gotten to that, and that's what I want to contribute to telling the story. So, eugenics goes back to in a way these two people. Darwin is well known and not necessary to elaborate on. But his cousin, Francis Galton, over there on the right, was the founder of a field called eugenics, or controlled evolution. He figured since if species are evolving, as my cousin says, we should get involved in trying to affect that evolution, to try to tailor it to the best possible outcomes. And that was the origin of the idea of eugenics, which has been put to nefarious use ever since then. The most notorious being the Nazi project of eugenics and euthanasia. That's how they define it. If you go to Berlin and look at all the memorials to the Holocaust, they're all described as memorials to euthanasia and to eugenics, and that's what the project, the sterilization and the killings in Nazi Germany were about eugenics. This is a poster telling you, the German citizen, that this handicapped man here is costing you 60,000 marks a year. This is your money too, and asking you to read Neues Volk, a Nazi journal, trying to recruit interest in this topic of how much the state is paying for people who are disabled. This is just a couple literature references. If I was going to do this as an academic paper, I'd spend a lot more time on the literature related to this, but I'll just highlight a couple people. I mean, many have already studied the U.S. connection to Nazi Germany. Many Americans don't know that we had a big influence on the Nazis. The Nuremberg laws preventing intermarriage between Jew and Gentile was inspired by the miscegenation laws of the U.S. And that's what Whitman's book discusses, and the Nazi sterilization program that started in the 1930s was inspired by California's sterilization program, which was driven in large part by several people at Stanford. And then this book, I'll refer to her a few times, Alexander Minastern. I think it's done the most sort of significant and extensive study of eugenics in the US. And one of the main points in this book that she's making is that while many have spoken of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory and a few other individuals as being key to the eugenics movement in the US, eugenics was probably more, she's arguing that California is a major center of eugenic practices, and that has not been recognized in the literature. And she doesn't explicitly say, name Stanford as a major institution behind that, but she discusses David Jordan and Louis Terman quite extensively. And it's not hard to put the pieces together with them and some others to notice the institutional role. And this is basically what I've just said. Most histories of eugenics point to Cold Spring Harbor as the main center of eugenic thought, and these two individuals as the key or among the short list of key actors. But in any history of eugenics, along with Charles Davenport, you'll see these three as well, who were all at Stanford. David Jordan, the first president, Louis Terman in the School of Education and Psychology that created IQ tests that were central to the eugenics movement and to the sterilization program in California. And Paul Popenoe, less well known, but equally significant to the others. He was a student of Jordan's who was very much at the center of California's sterilization program. It was an involuntary sterilization program. Okay, let's go into a little more detail. I'll talk a little bit about David Jordan, then about Louis Terman, and then Paul Popenoe, and then kind of some minor comments on some others. So Jordan, as this audience knows probably several of these things about him already, in addition to being the university's first president. As I just said, he was an acolyte of Louis Agassiz, whose statue was just removed, and an ichthyologist, okay, fish specialist. If anybody, it's perfectly okay not to know what an ichthyologist is. It's a word that one has to look up more than once. And as a eugenicist, one of the things he wrote about and spoke about most was the dysgenic effects of war. And I'll say a few more words about that in a minute. He was a member of several eugenic societies, including the Advisory Council of the Eugenics Committee of the U.S., which is probably sort of the central organization for U.S. eugenics, as well as several others, the Human Betterment Foundation, the Sierra Club, and the Save the Redwoods League. So there's a lot of disillusionment that happens when you do dive deep into this topic. I mean, the Sierra Club was originally a eugenic project, as was the Save the Redwoods League. Save the Redwoods League was founded by Madison Grant, who was the first major replacement theorists who today's replacement theorists look back to as their mentor. And the thinking at the time was that, environmentalism and eugenics were very connected. The thinking was that we need to preserve the best specimens of nature. That's why the focus was on like the redwoods, the sequoias. The other trees, I guess, didn't matter as much. But seriously, that's part of it. And along with that, the white race was this other, esteemed specimen of nature that needed to be preserved along with these other special trees. Now, of course, the Sierra Club and the Save the Redwood Leagues have changed their focus and dropped the race part of what they do and just focused on environmental issues. But that's how they started, and that's also why the sequoia tree is part of the Stanford logo. Jordan put it there, the tree, being analogous to other important specimens of nature, including the white race. Though white was not exactly the concept back then. That's a story I won't go into too much today, but people know the history of race in the U.S. What white emerges as a category at a certain point, and who is and who isn't white isn't always clear. In the archives of Terman and Jordan, they use terms like the American race, or the Nordic race, or the Anglo-Saxon race. Even those are not exactly correct designations for the people they were talking about. You can tell from the context they are talking about people that today would be called white, but who was white was differently determined in that era. So to say a few more words about Jordan, I'll introduce some of his thought through one of his books. He wrote several books. The Human Harvest is one of them, and these really outline his perspective. He has two kinds of human. One he calls vir, and the other one he calls homo. Vir was the virile was the virile man. Okay, who went forth in battle. Homo was the human being who remained on the farm and begat the new generations. As he says, vir gave place to homo. The sons of real men gave place to the sons of scullions, stable boys, slaves, camp followers, and the riffraff. And the second quote elaborates on the same point. The man of the quick eye and the strong arm gave place to the slave, the scullion, and the pariah. This is largely because this vir, the stronger man, had to go out into battle, and those are the ones that got killed, and leaving behind homo, this sort of the less fit people. And then the homo is the man whose lot does not change, because in him there lies no power to change it. So at the end, the barbarian settled and peopled the empire rather than conquered it, which is actually a lot like contemporary replacement theory. Toward the end of this book, he gives this interesting proposal, and I had to read this page several times. This is kind of my attempt to summarize what he's saying, because he's a little bit circuitous in what he's describing, but he's proposing that, war is terrible because it kills off the best of us, but we could make it useful if we could round up the unemployed and have them fight each other to the death. Perhaps in Kentucky, he suggests. The dark and bloody ground of Kentucky could be made the arena. This would not interfere with trade in Chicago, nor soil the streets of Baltimore. The sort of strange Hunger Games kind of proposal for the eugenic problems of the country. And right after that, he kind of has a few lines that make it sound like he's like a little bit ambivalent about whether he should say this. Like, should we ever really propose something like this? So a hesitant offer from Jordan for some of the problems of the time as he saw them. He also co-wrote this book with a genealogist, Sarah Kimball, who helped him with a class he taught on genetics at Stanford. She came up with this pedigree chart of all these great families to show their genealogies and where the best genetic stock comes from. Okay, that DNA had not yet been discovered, but genes was a concept that predates that. I mean, it goes back to the Bible from Genesis. You have to be careful not to map contemporary genetics onto the thinking of this period, though they did talk about things like genetics and heredity. The conception of it was a little different than today. And this also, I think, summarizes his view well. The slums beget slums, okay, because they can't do anything else. There is no way of making the feeble-minded wise, nor to increase the caliber of moron intelligence. Suitable training is a help to all types of men, but education can never replace heredity. Okay, he was very convinced that heredity really determined your chances and your abilities, and education was, had a minor role. So this is an example of one of many kind of documents you find in the papers of David Jordan. And actually probably the most interesting thing to see here is almost illegible is the advisory council at the top of the letterhead, which includes This is the advisory council of the Eugenics Committee of the U.S., and it includes all the who's who of the eugenists of the 20th century in the U.S., including Jordan and Terman. They're both on there, and so is Wilbur, the third president of Stanford, as well as Paul Popenoe, who I'll talk about later, and the guys at Cold Spring Harbor, Madison Grant, the replacement theory New York lawyer who wrote The Passing of the Great Race. They're all up there. And in this letter, Jordan is being requested to help figure out who they're going to keep on in the advisory council and who they might invite to join it. It's one of several examples of that I think attests to how Jordan's peers saw him as an important figure in this movement. And all of the archival material, unless otherwise mentioned, are all from the archives and special collections here, including this one. So this is a letter from Charles Davenport, who in many histories of eugenics is probably the central figure in U.S. eugenics, based at Cold Spring Harbor. Here he's writing to Jordan as part of this other eugenics group, the American Breeders Association, and they're trying to put together meetings with state governors to alert them to the problems of eugenics. And in this letter, Davenport wants Jordan to be central in organizing the people who are going to go be part of this committee to meet with state representatives to alert them to this problem and let them know what they can do about problems of eugenics in their states. So he, was active in I guess we'd call this kind of lobbying or meeting with political leaders to shape policy. I think also showing the esteem that Davenport had for Jordan. Another similar letter. I'm just giving you tiny bits of what is a huge archive of correspondence by Jordan. There's a lot of letters like this that speak to his administrative work in eugenic societies and to his various speaking engagements. He was asked to be involved in projects all over the world. He traveled quite extensively speaking on eugenics around the U.S. And so a lot of his correspondence is that. A lot of his correspondence is ichthyology, a lot of questions about fish from various parts of the world as well, and then a lot of administrative stuff for the university, the very mundane, everyday fires he has to put out all the time with that part. He's had several hats that he wore. And this is, interestingly, from Margaret Sanger, who people know as the founder of what became Planned Parenthood at the time. It was called the Western States Conference on Birth Control and Population Problems. And in this letter, she's inviting Jordan to be a part of this conference and telling him that his esteem and prestige will be important to what she's trying to do. This third paragraph says, it is generally conceded that the spread of knowledge relative to birth control has now become universal. It is the opinion of some of the leaders of international thought that the movement must be controlled and directed into channels where it shall become a constructive force toward race betterment. Planned Parenthood was also a eugenic organization that also, like the Sierra Club, kind of shifted its focus and its ideology in later years. Today we know it as a place that defends women's reproductive rights. And at the beginning, though, it was more about, who should reproduce. Birth control was important to control, the breeding of some people and not others. So Terman, another important figure in this, who, was professor of education and psychology for an extended period here. He created the Stanford Binet IQ test, which is probably his most important role in eugenics. He was a member of several eugenics organizations, including the same organization I just showed you the letterhead for in the earlier slide, along with Jordan and Wilbur. He also helped shape, he was on a committee actually with Representative Johnson in Congress, and helped shape the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which reduced immigration to limited quotas out of eugenic concerns. This was a big moment in U.S. immigration history, where there was a standard percentage. You could only allow 2% of the number of people from each nationality into the U.S. After that point. Back in, I think it was 2017, yeah, the 100-year anniversary, the Stanford education, the School of Education, had an exhibit showing the history and the contributions of their program, and they highlighted Terman, and they mentioned that the only thing it said about him was Terman's gifted children in 1921. They explained that Terman, who earlier introduced the IQ test to America, launches his study of gifted children. The longest running survey carried out in psychology, it has yielded findings on education, longevity, and health. I mean, that's a very positive spin on the contribution, because they're just looking at the gifted part. So gifted was was the high end of a continuum that included, below that normal, and below that feeble-minded, moron, imbecile, idiot. These are all scientific terms. Now one can't help but laugh at these terms, but that's actually their origin as far as I understand it. They're a certain score you were an idiot, a certain other score you were a moron. And so they're cutting out that part of his past, and also the fact that these intelligence tests could actually end up result in a person who got a low score being incarcerated in one of these colonies where they were forcibly sterilized, which happened to 20,000 people in the early 20th century. An interesting thing about Terman, the Stanford Binet test, is that just to back up to the words here, Stanford Binet IQ test. It was originally the Binet-Simon test. It was a test used in France, and Alfred Binet, the creator of this test, figured that it measured IQ, intelligence quotient, which was a concept a German psychologist had come up with. It measured something, though, that Binet thought could be modified. If you had a low IQ, you were entitled to intervention to raise it. The assumption in France was that this was a malleable thing. For some reason, when it's adopted in the U.S. by first Henry Goddard and also Louis Terman, they decide that it measures something you're born with that is immutable. It's unchangeable. You're stuck with it for life. There's an interesting cultural backstory too. I think about why the difference. Why did the Americans, perceive of this as something hardwired, and the French didn't. Terman also wrote several books. I'll introduce some of his thoughts from his own words. Here's an excerpt from probably his best known work, The Measurement of Intelligence. And he's referring to MP and CP, who are two people that took his IQ test. And he's saying that they represent the level of intelligence which is very common among Spanish, Indian, and Mexican families of the Southwest, and also among Negroes. Their dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in the family stocks from which they come. The fact that one meets this type with such extraordinary frequency among Indians, Mexicans, and Negroes suggests quite forcibly that the whole question of racial differences and mental traits will have to be taken up anew and by experimental methods. The writer predicts that when this is done, there will be discovered enormously significant racial differences in general intelligence, differences which cannot be wiped out by any scheme of mental culture. And children from this group should be segregated into special classes and be given instruction which is concrete and practical. They cannot master abstractions, but they can often be made efficient workers able to look out for themselves. And I remember reading that actually several years back, and now thinking, so why did they name my middle school after this guy? This really sounds like it's so much the opposite of what we consider to be important in he was an educator, but not of the kind that we value today. But he usually didn't write about race in this sense, the sense that we know it today. Black, white, what was his term? Mexican, I mean, by which he means what we would call Mexican American, or Chicano, Chicana, which were the most significant racial categories in his world in California at that time. This is an image from the back of a letter that one of Terman's correspondents sent to him. I don't know what you call this. It's not letterhead, or a watermark. It's like on the back. But it's like an interesting little poster. Actually, they're selling it, $1 a piece. The Descent of Man poster. This represents the main concern of eugenicists in terms of race at the time. They were concerned about different kinds of people that we would all today consider white. And so people like Terman and Jordan were most concerned that that people, immigrants from Poland or Italy or Jews from Eastern Europe would intermarry with the white race, or the American race as they called it, and that would result in less genetically fit offspring, in degeneration. And you have the terms here up here, the Mediterranean mutation, which is the type that they were concerned of, and the Nordic novation was the idealized racial type of the time. And it may be they were most concerned about this is because there was intermarriage between these groups in the U.S. There wasn't black-white intermarriage. Maybe that's why they didn't talk about this sort of issue as much, because, well, anti-miscegenation laws also made that a difficult thing to accomplish, but there was much more intermingling between these groups, and that's why the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act focused on keeping people from Mediterranean and eastern parts of Europe out of the country. Perhaps most significant in the story is California's sterilization program, and you can see an extensive discussion of this in that book I showed you earlier. Alexandra Minostern, University of Michigan professors, Eugenic Nation. She researched this project quite thoroughly, and of the 60,000 involuntary sterilizations that occurred in this country in the first half of the 20th century, 20,000 were done in California. Terman's IQ tests were used to justify sterilization, and people with Spanish surnames were 2.4 times more likely to be sterilized. There's no racial recording of who was sterilized, but by the surname, you're able to figure out that many more Mexican Americans were sterilized than white people. Those were the two main racial groups. Other groups there's very little evidence of other groups. And individuals were committed to one of several colonies in California, sometimes just based on the results of an IQ test. Sometimes they did something, some kind of misdemeanor, or they're having trouble in school, they're a difficult kid, and they did an IQ test, and then they end up being incarcerated, or they had several kids, and the state decided this person shouldn't have any more and gave them the IQ test and determined that they are feeble-minded or literally a moron. And one could protest, one could resist the order for sterilization. That happened on many occasions. What usually happened, though, was that the individual was told, or their guardian was told, often the guardian objected to the sterilization procedure. They were saying, okay, you don't have to be sterilized, but you just can't leave the institution. So, continued incarceration was the incentive to accept the sterilization procedure. From the archive, this is a program announcement for a eugenics congress that was going to happen in New York City in 1932. You see Charles Davenport from Cold Spring Harbor is the president of this, and Terman was on the board of people organizing this as well. This is an interesting letter from the archive to Davenport from Terman expressing one of his concerns for the conference. And this is interesting because this is where my own home discipline, this is where the anthropologists come in. Here, maybe we'll go on this side of it this time. So he's discussing the plans, and in the second paragraph he says, the only additional topic I think of, the only additional topic I think, if that possibly ought to be reported, has to do with the nature-nurture problem in the development of intelligence. As you know, there are a good many psychologists and anthropologists these days, also sociologists, who are inclined to argue that the intelligence that an individual develops during childhood and adult life is determined largely, if not entirely, by his cultural environment and his formal training. If that is true, then eugenics has no place as far as intellectual differences in human beings are concerned. Its principles would apply, if at all, only to physical traits. Should not a problem so fundamental to the scope of eugenics receive discussion at this meeting? So he's bringing up this sort of threat to eugenics that is emerging in the wings at the time. In particular, Franz Boas, well-known early anthropologist at Columbia University, was very much fighting the eugenicists, touring the country, giving lectures against eugenic thinking. And then he had a couple well-known students who went on to be professors, Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, that also followed up that message, but that was a little later, and then also focused on gender. And then we did actually see a shift in what we might call mainstream thinking. I mean, eugenics was very, very mainstream, but then the sort of new cultural relativist thinking brought forth by people like Franz Boas in his circle and the psychologists referred to here. I don't know exactly who he has in mind, but that's something I want to find out. So Paul Popenoe, another figure not as well known as Jordan and Terman in the world of eugenics, but somebody who is often mentioned in histories of eugenics in this country. So he studied at Stanford with Jordan. He started at Occidental College, but someone there said, no, for what you're interested in, you really should go to Stanford and study with this guy, David Starr Jordan. So he did just that. And he went on to become the editor of this Journal of Heredity. He was also the member of several eugenics organizations as well, including the Human Betterment Foundation, along with Terman and Jordan. And he was the author, with Ezra Gosney, of this significant book, Sterilization for Human Betterment. And I have a little quote from Kevlis's History of Eugenics. There was very much an exchange and mutual support between Popenoe and the California sterilization program and the early Nazi sterilization program. He was very central to the California sterilization program as well, very much an advocate and involved in that. I've already told you actually the numbers elsewhere. This is just another iteration of that. And this is the original cover for his book, or the book he co-authored with Gosney, Sterilization for Human Betterment. It was published in 1929, and immediately the next year it was translated into German because there was such intense interest in his book in Germany, in National Socialist Germany at the time. And his, let me just go back. Did I mention that already? This is an article in the journal that he edited, the Journal of Heredity, in which he's praising the Nazi sterilization program. And in this letter, he's trying to make the point that some might say that it was just an accident that it happened to be the Hitler administration that was ready to put into effect the recommendations of specialists. But Hitler himself had long been a convinced advocate of race betterment through eugenic measures. Then goes on to elaborate why Hitler should get credit for it. Wasn't just an accident. This guy should get the credit. You know, he's kind of defending that position. Then he goes to the book. He mentions Hitler wrote this book called Mein Kampf while he was in prison, and during that time he studied eugenics, and he's been a long-term advocate. So he wants to give credit where credit's due for the German sterilization program in this article. And Popenoe opened a place called the Institute of Family Relations. Actually, this phrase is a little bit misleading. It's called positive eugenics, okay? He opened the American Institute for Family Relations in Pasadena, and the idea was, well, negative eugenics is sterilizing people or killing them, and positive eugenics is encouraging reproduction among the right people, encouraging fertility among the people you want to reproduce. And the American Institute of Family Relations started in the 1930s, and it was inspired by early Nazi foundations that were similar, trying to encourage reproduction among people who were seen to be the most fit. But Popenoe pivoted to focusing on the positive, quote unquote, after the Nazi final solution, after Americans became aware of how far the Nazis took the eugenic project. So in other words, eugenics fell out of favor after this in the US, at least the negative kind, the forced sterilization. The positive eugenics you could continue to push, and that's exactly what Popenoe and others did at this point. It wasn't just the Nazi final solution and the public awareness of that. As I mentioned earlier, Boasian scholars, feminist scholars a little bit later, civil rights activists also later on, eventually pushed eugenic thinking to the sideline and made it something that our, at least sort of mainstream thinking, looked down upon in this country at that point. But as another example of so-called positive eugenics, you had fitter family contests. This is an example of that, where you would, try to have, where people would compete, kind of like the county fair, showing off the best pig. You would compete to see who had the best, most eugenically fit child in these contexts. So another example of positive eugenics. And then we can look into what we might call the continuing legacies. Yeah.
When did the attention get switched to Jews?
Oh, well, that was all part of the Nazi. I would say that they were lumped in with other groups.
It had nothing to do with California, did it?
You mean among the Nazis? Yeah.
Oh, no, the California eugenics prior to Nazis.
Right. No, it didn't, although Jews were among the people that they thought were less fit. If you look back to that image of the Mediterranean mutation and the Nordic novation, the different kinds of what we today call white people, they thought Jews were among the Mediterranean mutation, although we don't today think of it as a Mediterranean identity. But they were lumped in, Eastern European Jews along with, Italians, even Greeks, Poles who weren't Jews that were coming into the U.S. in the early 20th century were all considered dysgenic.
If they were honest to their studies of IQ, it seems like there's a disconnect in there.
There's a lot of inconsistency, in what they did. Trying to remember off the top of my head, I'm not recalling, but someone did report on the IQ of Jews, and I forget if it was Terman, but yeah, I'm not saying it's consistent. After Jordan, you could say we had Ray Lyman Wilbur, who was the third president of Stanford. He was also a member of the Advisory Council of the Eugenics Committee of the U.S., that same group that Terman, Jordan, and Popenoe were also on. He was a physician and helped found the School of Medicine here, and insisted on eugenics training be included in the curriculum there. He later became Secretary of the Interior after Herbert Hoover, a member of the first graduating class of Stanford, became president. Hoover was also a close friend of Jordan, and it's interesting to read in the archive the exchange between them. There's several letters from the White House to Hoover. From Hoover to Jordan. Just random stuff, even invitations to go camping, actually, among them. But also comments on, thanks for your notes on my speech about war. Hoover is telling Jordan in one of the letters. So apparently he, reviewed Hoover's work. He had the ear of the president for a period of time. I don't know what he said to him, whether eugenics was part of that conversation, but they knew each other well, and Wilbur ended up in the Hoover. I was going to say the Hoover Institute, the Hoover administration. So some people, including Alexander Stern's Eugenic Nation, claims a link between the concern about population, represented by Paul Ehrlich and the Zero Population Center at Stanford. And that, I think, is a more ambiguous case. I mean, some of the rhetoric is the same, but some of it's also different as well. But some people say that there's a connection there. And it arose after the Hart-Celler Act. So it's interesting. The Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 that I mentioned earlier, that Terman was helped pass. He was on the committee. Restricted immigration until 1968. Hart-Celler got rid of the quotas that were put in the earlier act, and suddenly immigration was much more unregulated. Stern argues that the population bomb and concerns about population was the reaction to that new phase in immigration. And William Shockley, who is probably well known to you too, but from a much later period. Okay, he joined Stanford. There are the years when he was here. He was the inventor of the I find that such an interesting story. He got the Nobel Prize for inventing the superconductor, and then he.
You said superconductor.
Oh, I'm sorry, semiconductor. Yeah, superconductor. And then he pivots to trying to prove white supremacy for the rest of his career, and he even stored his sperm for posterity and other interesting moves like that. To add to this discussion with a few comments from the archives at Cold Spring Harbor, I thought it was interesting to note in the papers of Charles Davenport, again, that person who is listed often as a key, if not the key, American eugenicist. In several of his papers, when he's asked to comment on eugenics or intelligence, he passes the question off to Stanford experts, such as in this article, this letter, which is a response to a Dr. Harris who had asked him questions on the heredity of genius. And he begins by saying, the most exhaustive study of the inheritance of genius is the work done in California by Miss Cox and others. Ms. Cox was a student of Terman's. I will add more precise information at the bottom of this letter, and so in that he included an attachment with several citations, including Cox's work and some of Terman's books as well. So I thought it was interesting that on several occasions, the person who was at the most considered often the most central institution of eugenics would turn to a Stanford expert in response, not just in this letter, but in some other letters. It's hard to evaluate, though, exactly the role of Cold Spring Harbor. When you look through their archives, they're a fraction of what Stanford has. I mean, the papers of Jordan, could fill a room. It's like 120 boxes of them. And there's like 4 of Davenport. And there isn't a whole lot of advocacy about eugenics in that. And I don't know if that's just because fewer materials got to the archive for some reason in Cold Spring Harbor than they did here. Something I want to look into, but this suggests, and I think some of the other examples I've shown earlier, that these individuals at Stanford were very significant in this movement. But Davenport repeatedly is looking to them for advice, helping them asking them to help decide how to form committees for certain projects. So arguably, Stanford is a very significant, and perhaps rival to Cold Spring Harbor as an institution in the history of 20th century eugenics. And here's some examples of continuing legacies in our society more recently. Today, eugenics hasn't completely gone under the carpet. It's still present. Jeffrey Epstein, before he went to jail, gave a lot of money to Harvard for the program in evolutionary dynamics to investigate eugenics. The program is still around. They disown eugenics, but they're still there. They took his money. I'm not sure what their next step is after this. He actually had a eugenics project. Part of what he did was he was trying to he thought he was a genius, and he needed to, like Shockley, needed to spread his seed, and he had a plan to impregnate women at several ranches that he had developed, and you perhaps know some further details about that and why he therefore ended up in jail. Donald Trump and his head of Homeland Security, Stephen Miller, have invoked eugenic discourses on many occasions in public speeches. There's even an interesting conference coming up next month in Austin, Texas. They called the Natal Conference, with several prominent eugenics speakers meeting together to keep the flame burning. The New York Times magazine earlier this year presented a story of the Relf sisters who were sterilized without consent. And it asked, what does the government owe them, and thousands of other living victims, some of them from the eugenics programs, the sterilization programs earlier in the 20th century, but some from more recent sterilizations. It kept on going on, but more from rogue actors than official state policy. I mean, it was legal back when it was done in California. There was a Supreme Court case I'm forgetting the year, in which the court decided the state could forcibly sterilize people because they bought the eugenic argument of the danger to the public welfare of unfit people reproducing. And finally, I want to add that, of course, I'm not trying to paint all of Stanford with the same brushstrokes. This was, I think, a very significant movement among important people at this university. But this university, of course, represents a whole bunch of different opinions and perspectives, some that even go completely against eugenic principles. And just one person, I'm mentioning Dana Fu-Wiley in anthropology because I know her work, and I've even taught this book, The Enculturated Gene, which is a terrific deconstruction of what sickle cell is and how genetic ideas apply to medical practices in Africa and Europe. Also, if you look at the work of Martin Carnoy, who actually has been in the education program longer than Louis Terman has. He wrote this book in 2019, Transforming Comparative Education on 50 Years of Theory Building at Stanford, describing a whole variety of other initiatives developed in that school of education that have nothing to do with eugenics, in fact, even go in the opposite direction. So, of course, we have many people doing things from a variety of perspectives, even working against eugenic ideas in this institution. And I want to thank the archives here and access to those materials, which are central to this project, as well as those at Cold Spring Harbor and the Stanford Historical Society for inviting me for this, and thank you for your attention.
So first is when you were talking about the involuntary sterilization, was it more or less uniformly applied to both men and women, or selectively to, you said it was selectively applied to Hispanics?
Right. That's a good question. I know I've read that, and I don't remember what the answer is. It is both men and women. I don't remember if the women or men were disproportionately more to their proportion of the general population, but it was men and women.
The others, I've just commented that
Yes.
I saved all of Bill Shockley's papers.
Oh.
He was my next door neighbor, and I trucked it all to his garage when he was retired and passed away. I actually got it all to Emmy, and then when she was in ill health, I trucked it to got Henry Lowood in the archives at Stanford to take it all. But I trucked in about six trunkloads from my car.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because he recorded every talk. Every time he was on the telephone, he recorded every phone call he ever made.
Wow, okay. Well, it's good to learn how stuff gets to the archives. Great. Uh-huh.
So I have a mic, thanks.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your talk. Eugenics was by no means, a mainstream in terms of social science thought in the early 20th century, but here at Stanford, it was, right? And so as you point out in several slides, you have anthropology and Boas and Margaret Mead, et cetera, criticizing this. So why do you think Stanford was such fertile ground for these kinds of ideas?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and that's something I'm trying to answer myself. I don't, know if I know. There is actually, let's see if I can quickly find the reference. There's an article by, Clementine Beauvais, California Genius, Louis Terman's Gifted Child in Regional Perspective. And I think there was something about the appeal of nature in California, especially to individuals who moved here. Again, individual white, what we'd say called white people. I mean there were already it's part of Mexico for a long time, and there were people of Mexican and Filipino descent here, and then white people came from the East and the Midwest, and many of them attracted by an idealized view of nature that I think may have been part of the idea, and that genius was part of the bounty of nature. That is what I think maybe that's what Beauvais says motivated Terman, and some of the writings. Actually, you can see this in Jordan's letters to colleagues elsewhere in the country. His kind of waxing romantic about the nature of the West. And I think that there's something about the attraction of nature. There is some, I don't know, I think there's even perhaps continuities to things that are going on today and to why Silicon Valley developed here in terms of interest in nature and technology, but I only have cloudy ideas about that. I think that's a really great question. I wanted to know. Yeah.
Thanks.
So, yeah, why don't you?
Yeah, maybe I'll do one from the online audience over here.
Yeah.
We have several questions that have come in about, and you talked a little bit about this already, sort of what opposition views there may have been at Stanford among the faculty, among the Stanfords themselves, particularly Jane, who knew Jordan. And so what, if you can comment on sort of opposing views, or if it was that mainstream.
Yeah, no, that's a good question that I also don't know the full answer to. I know that that Jane Stanford opposed some of his eugenic ideas. More specifically, as I understand it, the Chinese American question. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in the late 19th century that Jordan supported, and Jane, I believe opposed, or at least she argued with him about that. And I don't know what the textual source of this is. I actually have a colleague who's an archaeologist at Queens College who, before she came to us, she did a postdoc at Stanford excavating the Chinese American camp where the workers who built the university lived, and she, this is something she learned from her team of archaeologists who were working there. They did, and so that's their story, that they bumped heads over at least the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I'm not sure about other debates. I mean, I actually looked. I wondered, was eugenics a factor in Jane Stanford's murder or death? I mean, as I'm sure many of you know, there's been several books now on the death of Jane Stanford and the mysterious circumstances under which it occurred, and many people who believe that Jordan was behind this. And I wondered if there was was eugenics part of the argument, and I couldn't find any evidence that it was, and I'm not saying that he killed her necessarily either, but I do understand why a lot of people would think so. But if eugenics was a factor, there's, and then there was the Edward Ross case. Edward Ross was a Stanford faculty member who was a eugenicist, but of a very different kind. I wondered whether I should include him in this legacy. He he very much believed in environmental influence on people. He did not believe in genetic determinism, even though he was a eugenist. And I won't go into it for the sake of time, but you can be a eugenicist without being a genetic determinist. And I'll just leave it at that. And there's a story of his firing that's kind of related, but I'll just move on for the sake of time to yes. Uh-huh.
I have two questions. One is probably pretty quick, which is I noticed you didn't mention Cubberley, and I wondered if you have anything to say about him. But also, I'm wondering about the origins of eugenics and our infatuation with standardized testing in general, and if you could comment on that.
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, Cubberley, there was also a Palo Alto High School named after him. It's not clear that he was a eugenist. I looked into at least the secondary source literature on that. No one seems to have written that. He did hire Terman and wrote I think the preface or foreword to one of Terman's books, and was sort of a supporter, but nothing in kind of his academic research or work indicated that he explicitly supported eugenics. So no real evidence. And the whole standardized testing, I think there's a whole story about standardized testing and even our current ideas of intelligence that go back to this period. Like when you talk about your students as a faculty member, this guy is so smart, or she's such a brilliant student. I think we sound like we're talking about innate ability, but I don't think we often mean that. I think we really still don't have any other way of talking about a student who does really well without bringing up these kind of innate ability IQ ideas. So I think there's a whole,
So I have a couple of stories that I would that tell you about the continuing effect of, say, Terman in particular. So I had an office in Jordan Hall for 50 years, and it started in '69. And when I got here, there's still a project that started with Terman's identification of all of these kids who were very smart, identified apparently by their teachers and so on, and there were 1,000 of them. And there was this long-term, and there's a long-term study of the kids who were that way, and they were looked at every 10 years for something like 80, 90 years,
right.
a long time.
The termites, right? They
were called the termites. That was the point. And in fact, one of my colleagues was a termite, and we all knew this. And he used to, this is the kind of thing that you would drop and his name was Bob Sears. So if anybody, all of you people who know Bob Sears, he was one of the termites. And I think there were other termites. They got to know each other quite well. But the point was, we have a closet in Jordan Hall that contains all that information for the many years. Right. And as far as I know, it was worked on by colleagues of mine until about 15, 20 years ago. Okay. That's one story. The other story is about a guy named Harry Harlow. Now, I don't know if you know who, he was a PhD in the psychology department, probably in the 50s or 60s. 50s. And he's very famous for his work on monkeys and mothering monkeys who had wire mothers versus soft mothers. And he did all of his work at the University of Wisconsin. Well, his real name, of course, is Harry Israel. And he was given advice by someone in the department, and I suspect it was Terman, who said, that's a name that you don't want to have out there because it sounds Jewish, and you'll never get anywhere if you keep this name. And in fact, those people, many of us know that his father lived in Palo Alto, and his name was Delmer Israel. Maybe you guys, there were people, he ran this kind of typewriter shop. But anyway, Harry was the son of this, but this was telling you about the anti-Semitism of that era. So he changed his name, or at least academically, to Harlow, which he kept forever after. He's now, I don't know when he died, probably 10, 15 years ago.
Interesting. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, and the Terman's termites, I think, is actually probably the longest, I think, longitudinal study now anywhere in psychology or in the social sciences. I forget the category.
Well, the fact that there's still a closet full of that data.
Yeah. Yeah.
If anyone wants to look at it.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
What was going on at the Palo Alto Unified School District that they were picking? Like, I get the whole concept, but it's a pretty tight list of people, and they had all these people to pick from, and ichthyology is not education. So, do you have any sense from the history of PAWS why these guys were so venerated that they ended up on our T-shirts?
Yeah, no, that's that's right. Yeah, no, it wasn't right. It wasn't ichthyology. It was the eugenics that they all had in common.
But what was it in the education team that was naming schools in the 50s? It's like, well, that's a good idea.
Yeah, right. That's exactly the question I asked, and one of the first things that intrigued me in this to do this research, and I don't know the answer to that. As I mentioned earlier, I wrote the Palo Alto Unified School District Board about this issue and heard nothing back, and knew also that parents had also been on this, and it resulted in name changing. So, but I don't know the backstory. Actually, after learning more about eugenics in general for this research, reading Stern and Kevlis and other historians that I've mentioned, I realized, it's probably because it was just mainstream thinking at the time. So whoever named the schools after them went, who should we name our school at? Well, I think they were the heroes of education at the moment. But I don't know. I mean, I would like to actually also go into the Palo Alto School District's archives. I mean, it's on my to-do list to find out why. Was there a board meeting with minutes where they decided, should we stop at 3 eugenicists, or is that enough? I don't know.
Did you guys know that?
Part of 101.
There's still quite a
Oh, really?
sign on Highway 101 beyond Fort Stanford.
Oh, I didn't. Okay, huh. So yeah, I don't know who. You guys probably know who. Okay,
someone online.
Yeah.
Online.
So another question from the online audience is around kind of how other universities, how eugenics kind of played out at sort of peer institutions. What did it look like at Harvard, on the East Coast, et cetera? It was less of a central issue, I would say. I mean, there were individual major eugenicists at other institutions, but I think Stanford and Cold Spring Harbor were the main ones. Agassiz was at Harvard, and as was Ernest Houghton, a biological anthropologist and eugenicist, and so Harvard had a few too. And I don't know anybody who's really, if anybody has looked into, I haven't come across a sort of a history of eugenics at Harvard. It's something on my to-do list too. I think I need to, I'm making the claim that Stanford rivals Cold Spring Harbor or is one of the most important eugenics institutions because all these historians say Cold Spring Harbor is. And if you compare just the two of them, they look equal, but I don't really know enough about the other ones. I mean, historians have not included other institutions in their histories as major institutions, and they haven't included Stanford either. So that's my answer, which is just only a partial knowledge. Here? Okay, yes.
Somewhere I remember from high school American history, there was mention of a group in upstate New York called the Oneida Farm, if I remember correctly. And I think there was some mention of eugenics in connection with this farm community in the 1840s. Given its relative proximity to Cornell and that Jordan came from Cornell, is there any connection between the Oneida group, if I'm even remembering correctly what they did, and possibly Jordan while he was at Cornell before he came here?
A good question. I've just noted down, investigate Oneida Farm in Cornell. I mean, that's something I'd like to follow up on. I haven't come across that. That's possible. And there's a number of eugenicists that started out in Indiana, which is one of the first places to pass to legalize forced sterilization, and there's an Indiana story possibly. There's a lot of avenues I don't know yet, and that might be one of them. By the way, since you mentioned upstate New York, one little footnote to add that I didn't mention during the presentation. Another reason why I think Jordan was so important vis-a-vis Cold Spring Harbor was actually Jordan helped bankroll Cold Spring Harbor. He was connected to Mrs. Mary Harriman, who was the widow of E.A. Harriman, a financier and a railroad tycoon who owned the Union Pacific Railway alongside other railroads. And he was a eugenicist. And Harriman State Park in just outside of New York City is actually named after them because the land was put aside, part of the eugenic environmentalist thinking. But Terman was able to tap into the Harriman money to get Cold Spring Harbor going, which is, I think, a really important part of that history. So, yeah. I'm sorry, I'll let you, I think you guys know who was next, so I guess we're going back there, yes.
So I've come across a couple references that Herbert Hoover in the 1910s and 20s was a eugenicist and a sponsor of the 1921 Eugenics Conference. Have you come across any of that?
No, I haven't. I wouldn't surprise me. As I mentioned, I did see correspondence between Hoover and Jordan in Jordan's papers. None of it touched on eugenics, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there as a topic. I just haven't seen it, but I think that would be really interesting to learn that. And as I mentioned, Jordan had the ear of the president, and corresponded with him. And I would be interested was there any interest in, and Wilbur actually, as Secretary of the Interior in the Hoover administration, did speak about eugenics in that capacity. But I haven't seen Hoover himself, maybe it's out there.
Mm-hmm. In the Stanford Chaparral in the early 20s, there was a short joke. It was something along the lines of, who's that man with the funny little cross-eyed boy? That's the professor of eugenics and his son. Do you know if Frederick Terman was cross-eyed as a boy? Or did Terman have other children who were, but clearly Stanford students knew that eugenics was a program.
Good question. I don't know. In all I've read on Terman, I have not seen anybody mention that. But that's intriguing. Yeah. And yeah, what did the students know about? There's lots of other. This makes me think also. Steinbeck also in the Cannery Row had comments on the eugenics going on, and there's. Yeah.
I have a question. Most of the people are not alive that were in your presentation, but one of them who is alive is Paul Ehrlich, and I was a little bit surprised to see him up there, and there were no quotes or anything like that. And he was advocating, I'm not necessarily an Ehrlich, but he was advocating ZPG, but he lived it also, so he wasn't advocating for somebody else. So I'm curious how he got on the list, and if anybody's actually talked with him about this. It seems like that would be fair since he's still alive. I will also say that I think some of these places got named not because they were eugenicists, but because they were the president of Stanford and the founder of the California Academy of Sciences and prominent individuals. And they were professors. So I don't think they were. They're unnaming them because they're eugenicists. They weren't named because they were eugenicists.
That's true. Right. Yeah, maybe the other theory is everybody was a eugenicist. So even if they were named for some reason, they also happened to be a eugenicist. There could have been other factors. But yeah, regarding Paul Ehrlich, that's actually why I said, what did I say exactly? That
quotes or anything that are pertinent?
Well, my view, I think I phrased it as something. I think that it's something that's I think an ambivalent case. And I've just put it. Oh, it's not here anymore. I found the slide again. I mentioned that as a possible continuing legacy, mainly because Alexandra Stern, in her history of eugenics, puts his work in the same genealogy, and Banu Subramaniam, who also wrote a history of science and eugenics and evolution, also says the same thing. So I'm not sure if it's a good argument, but a couple those two have said that. And so that's my answer. It's something I'm not committing to that interpretation, but people have said that. I believe they pointed out the populations that he thought were growing too fast were some of the same populations that were targeted by eugenicists. He might have said in his defense, but I'm pointing them out because they're growing too fast, not because I think that they are less entitled to do that. And he might have pointed out that it was things like poverty driving the growth of the. So it's two people have said this, and that's not something that I have investigated myself and would say is necessarily eugenic. Okay, so it deserves an asterisk. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and one name that seems quite glaring here is none other than Gerhard Harden. So did he draw much from Jordan and the like in how it's often said how he used things like what seemed to be pretty respectful, things like tragedy of commons and such, to launder his more extreme views like eugenics, white supremacism, and all that. He's actually named the white supremacist by the Southern Public Law Center, for instance, so Gerhard Harden. So did he draw upon many of those you name, like the Terman and Jordan and all those? Like, where were his antecedents to that?
I don't know enough about him to say. Yeah, other than that's a good question. Again, I'm just going to add him to my list of people to look into. Yeah. From what you're aware, does it sound like it's a similar discourse?
Well, it sounds like it because from what he's arguing, he basically frames in a way that makes it sounds respectful. That, for example, by using tragic commons, depending on how you read into it, you could mention, but once you do know his background, you can probably deduce that it was an attempt of his to launder.
Yeah, maybe. After the Nazi final solution and eugenics falling out of favor, I would say, as I've hinted to, there's still a continuity of that thinking, but that becomes harder to trace because in a way it kind of goes underground. The earlier 20th century, it's really, there's a whole archive, literally, of who was influencing who. But for later individuals,
like it's the 60s, when he was.
Right, like Paul Ehrlich too. It's like, and you can kind of show associations or similarity in terms of thinking and categories. But with the earlier eugenicists, you have kind of much more literal eugenic statements that are more unambiguous, like some of the quotes I have from some of their books. Early on, I think people like Harden and Ehrlich, it's more associative than it is, but it may still be there.
Murphy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Last question.
Okay.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. So I'm the head TA of a course called Stanford and Its Worlds, which is a history of Stanford University, and we do a lot in thinking about the campus itself as a primary source teaching us about the university. So I love how you started with, the statue and how it has been removed. And you make a point to say that your stance is that, if we remove this without kind of giving explanation and telling the stories, that, we're making ourselves look eternally virtuous. Right. So I wanted to, and this is perhaps a little bit out of the historical wheelhouse, but how do you think we should continue to tell this story past simply academic works? Should we continue thinking about how this could be physically inscribed on campus, or other alternative methods of retelling this?
Okay, yeah, good question. Actually, when I first started investigating this, it was before they removed Agassiz statue and actually chiseled the name. I mean, it was written in stone, but you can chisel stone away. I guess we need a new metaphor. And I would have said at the time, would I suggest, based on this work that I was beginning, that Stanford got to remove these names? I don't think I would have necessarily been in favor of that. I would have probably been more keen to add something explaining who these people were. Maybe a plaque in front of Jordan Hall saying who Jordan was might have been another option. So I think, this is part of a broader question in this country. How do we deal with these people of the past? I think, to me, if it's a a statue of a Confederate general that was put up in the 1930s, and there are plenty of statues like that. It wasn't like in the height of the war. Then maybe that's an easier thing to get rid of. But the more ambiguous parts of our history, maybe we need, to add context to it. We need to build, instead of taking it away, build something next to it that explains the context. So I think that, all the university has done so far is remove the names. I would put something in their place somewhere. An interpretive sign, but it might have been more meaningful if Jordan's name actually was still on the wall, and suddenly there's no cue to put the context sign there once you remove the past. So it's an issue we struggle with that in many levels as a country, right? So, yeah.
Thank you so
okay.
much.
Thank you.